Welcome back to another episode from the Optimal Body Podcast. I'm Dr. Jen.
And I'm Dr. Dom.
And today we are talking about optimizing your hips so that even if you have pain right now, these are some exercises that you can do to help relieve it. But if you don't have pain, this is what we really want you to focus on so you don't have to suffer potentially and build more resilient hips. So let's get into it. Before we go into why hips become such an issue for people and why we believe they do and what exercises we really encourage you to focus on or to add into your day, we just want to remind you that we have more specific videos on different hip diagnoses, on different injuries within the body, pains that you might feel, specific, like really quick videos that I've showed on specific exercises you can do for different areas. And it's all available here on YouTube. We have different playlists that you can check out. And if you comment and you let us know what you're needing or what you want to see more of, that's how we know what new videos and content and education we can provide. So please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below.
We have done so many other podcasts on hip topics in general. So some of the ones that we've done are hip impingement, hip shift or rotated pelvis, snapping hip syndrome, hip flexor tightness, hip bursitis, piriformis, hips out of place or why did my hips go out of place, hip dysplasia, hip labrum issues, labrum tears, hip arthritis, and I know there are probably more in there, so we'll try and link those up down in the show notes or in the description of the YouTube video if you're watching on YouTube, just so if you have specific questions on a diagnosis or something more specific, you might find it in one of those episodes.
There are practices that we believe and exercises that if you do this on a daily basis, you're going to have a lot less occurrence of building hip issues. And one of the main reasons I think that we get hip issues in the first place is because of things like this. Well, I'm sitting cross-legged in my chair right now, but for the most part, we go from sitting in cars on the way to work to sitting at desks all day long to coming back into a car to sitting at the dinner table to sitting on the couch. And we're never getting our legs past that 90-degree angle in our hips unless you're going to like a yoga class or something that's intentionally putting you on the ground. But even then, for how long is that as opposed to all day long where we go from a sit to a stand 90 degrees?
When you do something for so long or do something a certain way for so long, you start to, again, not have that awareness. So you're not even realizing that you're doing things repetitively or that you do all movements with that quad dominance. And that kind of plays back to the first point of being in such a stagnant, stationary society. We just aren't getting the right kinds of movements and exercises in throughout the day. And again, it doesn't have to be exercise. It's not like, oh, you need to go get your hour of exercise at the gym. Like, we just need to move more and we need to have more variation so that our body, our brain, and our muscles can start to develop the ability to move dynamically through the world and feel comfortable doing so.
And I just want to, like, one little point, and I know I've brought this up before, and I heard this initially from Aaron Alexander, who we've had on the podcast before, and he was doing a lot of research for his book, and what he had found was that in cultures and societies where they got down on the ground and they prayed more often throughout the day, meaning that they're going into like a full child's pose position. So putting their knees all the way up to their chest, hips all the way in, and then getting up on the floor, which takes strength, getting down and getting back up and doing that multiple times a day, they actually had less occurrence of having hip osteoarthritis and needing hip replacement. So we're seeing, if you're getting yourself into your full range of motion more often throughout the day, you could have the potential to have less issues happening in the hips. And that's what we're trying to talk about, right? This lack of mobility, this lack of awareness within the body.
Which is why you and I do things like work sitting on the ground at the coffee table, work laying on our stomach. I mean, even
do a podcast sitting cross-legged.
Getting ready for these podcasts, I was laying on my stomach writing out things for a while, to the point where I was laying there for like 40 minutes and I'm like, oh, this is starting to irritate my back a little bit. So I had to move and get into a different position. But just having that variability. So, okay, let's list off some of our favorite hip exercises that we feel like everyone should implement to optimize hip health.
One that I think you'll see repetitively on my page, and I give it away for free all the time, is Hip 9090, because it really is just kind of a catch-all. If we can start to improve our joint mobility from the basic ground level, then when we start to get up and move, we have more of an opportunity to then move through our hips because there's more space in our joints to be able to move because we're opening up internal and external rotation. We're not just going to put all the pressure into our back or all the pressure into our knee. Our hip actually has room and space to open up. So I think that's just such a valuable exercise.
Yeah, and people don't think of hip rotation in general.
Yeah, we think of hip flexors.
We think of the hip flexors or the glute amnesia. I feel like those are like the two big buzzwords that people hear, but your hip rotation is actually very involved with the hip internal rotation and hip flexion are coupled together. And hip external rotation involves a lot of our glute muscles. So both of those and how Hip 9090 helps you passively and actively work on those are just absolutely great. Another thing we mentioned is the coordination of our hip muscles to our core muscles. So we think everyone should work on some variation of laying on your back, so you're laying supine with your face towards the ceiling and doing some sort of like marching exercise that's going to help you start to coordinate that core activation with hip movement. So the most basic is both your feet are on the ground and you're just starting to march one leg up, kind of alternating. You can do it where your legs are up in a tabletop and you're dropping down to heel taps. That's a little bit more advanced, all the way to something like a dead bug with a band around your feet, which we love because then it helps you strengthen through the hip flexors as you're holding one leg, pushing one leg down, the opposite arm goes up. And it's that type of coordination that's going to bring the awareness back that as I work my hip muscles, as I use my hip muscles, I also need to have this dynamic control through my core.
And it's really easy to just like kind of talk through right now. It's a lot harder to implement in practice if you're actually focusing on what is my rib cage in relation to my pelvis doing? What is my pelvic floor doing? How am I getting that full core coordination so that my hip flexors aren't taking over and popping when I'm doing these exercises? And that's why I will say, like, we have a whole core plan on Gen Health that walks you through step by step how to progress into these exercises and really find that baseline. And we've gotten so many reports of people like light bulbs going off who do these core on Gen Health. So it's so much more involved when you're actually getting that coordination and building that awareness. And one that I've really been enjoying is hip airplane. And recently, so hip airplane in general, like I used to do it just fully unsupported, not against a wall, not against anything, and just on the ground, and kind of thinking of like, it's almost like Warrior 3, where you're in like a single leg deadlift position and then you let one hip drop and you lift the other hip, which is great if you're doing it just like in the middle of the room.
It's also hard.
But it's so hard.
It's so hard in the middle of the room because like you don't realize how big your pelvis is and like how much it throws off your center of mass. So I really struggle with that because I got a big ass and a big hips. And so like when I start rotating my pelvis in that airplane type motion, like it's so hard for me to stay stable that I love what you're going to bring up about the variation. What
you do is you stand about a foot away from the wall. You kick the leg that's not going to be kind of working up against the wall. So your foot is flat and kind of pulled up the wall. And when you start to kind of get, without moving your knee, but if you kind of think about dragging your heel up the wall, you start to activate that posterior chain. So we're starting to already turn on our glutes and our hamstrings. And then you kind of hinge forward right at your hips and you move just on the leg that's kind of standing on the ground. You drop that hip and then you open that hip. And now we're working on that rotation that we just got from Hip 9090 on the floor, but we're making more functional and standing. We're opening up the posterior pelvic floor as I drop into internal rotation. So I'm helping my hinge better by relaxing some of the tissue down there. And then I'm opening up and I'm contracting through my glutes. So I'm teaching my hips how to move better in a functional standing position and finding better range of motion in my hips. And I'm telling you, you do 5 to 8 of these consecutively, my glutes are on fire the moment that I stop because I'm lengthening and I'm contracting. I'm lengthening and I'm contracting on that single leg, and it is tough. So that's like one of my favorites.
And that's almost a combination of the first two things we talked about with the hip rotation, because it really helps actively load through hip internal and external rotation, but also the way that you're pushing into the wall, it really helps you stay aware and activated through your core as you're doing these pelvic rotations. And this kind of leads into our fourth point, which is just stay strong.
Yes.
I mean, for everything. Like, of course, if there's pain, it's going to be tough to strength train. And that's why we kind of like to start with mobility first, because we need to have some foundational mobility before we go into strength. But strengthening around the hip in all the different planes of motion. Our hip moves in so many different directions. We have the quads on the front, so doing more quad dominant squat variation of sorts. For the glutes, doing more of a deadlift. For our adductors, we want to do some sort of side lunge variation or Cossack squat, something like that. And the outside of your leg, you want to maybe think think about doing like step ups or controlled step downs.
But really focusing on single leg stability work, I think is so huge too, and something that's often neglected and missed, especially if you're a runner or just someone who walks in life, because
if you're a runner or if you're a walker, like if you ever walk.
Yes.
And then that's what, like when people wonder, oh, why do I need to train single leg? It's like every time we walk, we are on a single leg. We're supporting our whole body.
You go up and down stairs. Like
the primary function of your hips is being able to support your body on a single leg.
Single leg step up, lateral step down, crossing a step down and doing more of like your leg behind like a curtsy, doing Bulgarian split squat, doing a single leg deadlift. Like I can go on and on, right? There's a ton of single leg exercises, but you're going to work on your balance. You're going to work on your hip and core control 100% because you're trying to avoid, things moving around crazy. And, it's so important to be strong within our body. That is how we help to improve mobility, stability, and become resilient against pain and injury.
Well, that's it. Thanks for joining us for another episode all about optimizing that hip health. If we didn't answer something or if you have any more questions, please put them down in the comments. Also, in the description of this video, we'll try to link all the previous episodes that we have done on specific hip diagnoses, just in case your question has to do with that. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and notification bell before you go, and we'll see you next time.